world is super divided, and it kind of always has been, but I think it really appeals to the hopeful part of all of us that believes that we can find good in other people and that we can learn to get along.
And enemies to lovers humanizes both sides.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Dallin Cooper, nonfiction author, and when we first met, Caitee stabbed me and left me for dead.
I'm Caitee Cooper, fantasy author, and luckily he forgave me and we fell madly in love.
Obviously, that's not true. Caitee never stabbed me. Have you ever stabbed me?
I mean, not intentionally?
Not that I can think of. But that is how it feels like a lot of enemies to lovers books go.
So welcome to our first trope talk, where we break down common book tropes, analyze when they work and when they don't work, and then talk about a couple of common examples in case you like that sort of thing.
So today, obviously, we're talking about enemies to lovers, which a quick Google search indicates is one of the most popular of all book tropes.
Now, if you're new to the idea of tropes, they're basically themes or structures that are used to make a story compelling. So for example, the enemies to lovers trope is when the love interests start out as enemies, obviously, and then over the course... Rewind that.
It's gonna be we're gonna have one of those in every video.
Every
Just
single one.
A close-up of Caitee going...
Over the course of the story, they fall in love.
It is a pretty classic trope. You could maybe even argue that Romeo and Juliet, hundreds of years ago, was a kind of enemies to lovers, even though they were never really enemies personally.
But the enemies to lovers trope is definitely at least 200 years old, because Pride and Prejudice is widely hailed as the original enemies to lovers, and it was published like 200 years ago, so.
So here's the question. Why does it work?
Because when done well, it can bring a lot to the story. It really incentivizes the author to make both of the characters have their own arcs, because a lot of the times in romance, I think you run into, like, the love interest. Like, the love interest becomes a cardboard cutout, you know what I mean?
Like, the love story is their personality.
Yeah.
It is their character arc.
Yeah, exactly. They're not their own person, they're just a hunk or a babe there for the other person to fall in love with. And
a femme fatale, like
Exactly.
James Bond style, where it's
Yes.
like, you are just a pretty woman for James Bond to sleep with.
Do we know any of the stories of the Bond girls? No, we don't. But Darcy and Lizzie are really good examples because everybody adores Lizzie and everybody loves Darcy. And they always have because they are such great characters. You just end up absolutely loving both of them. You root for them. You want them to end up together and they're good people. There's also the element of tension and conflict. And that's what makes a story move. There's a saying like, the cat sat on the mat is not a story, but the cat sat on the dog's mat, there's a story, you know? So the romantic chemistry combined with all the conflict and stuff is really what keeps people on the edge of their seat and what makes enemies to lovers so compelling.
I guess there's also the element of progress. It gives a clear indication of character growth and progression through the story. You know, that things are moving forward. Which is always satisfying, and the same reason that those TV shows that never knew exactly how many seasons they were going to have, and did the endless will they won't they, those always got really frustrating because there wasn't any forward movement.
Exactly. And I think that's where the friends to lovers trope kind of runs into issues sometimes, is because they're already friends, they've already gotten to know each other, they already generally like each other.
You're one step from the top of the progression and you just boop.
Yep, and that's all. Just boop, yep.
Whereas enemies to lovers can be this whole journey.
Yeah, exactly. And I think another reason why this resonates so much with us, especially right now, is that the world is super divided, and it kind of always has been, but I think it really appeals to the hopeful part of all of us that believes that we can find good in other people and that we can learn to get along.
That's one of my favorite parts. I have both a keynote and a podcast that's called They Might Not Be Crazy. And the first version of that keynote was called They Might Not Be Evil, because I'm all about the idea of seeing other people's perspectives and realizing that the world isn't as us versus them as we first thought.
Yeah, I think deep down we all know that the idea that the world is a battle between good and evil people isn't helpful because it's not true.
But it also makes for really good stories, so most stories have a little bit of good guys and bad guys, and then they
Yes.
fight.
Yes, but the most nuanced stories are the ones where the good guys and the bad guys make sense because they have their motivations and they have their histories and they have their dreams and hopes and fears and whatever. And so,
And enemies to lovers humanizes both sides.
yes.
They aren't just faceless evil people. It's like they're individuals, and some of them might not be evil.
Yeah, it hits on a lot of different levels, which is why it's so popular. We'll try not to be too specific so we can avoid spoilers, but what are some of the enemies to lovers examples that you like the most?
Personally, I like them more when it's a little bit closer to rivals to lovers.
Oh, yes. 1,000 times yes.
Yes. 1,000 times yes.
Anything in the academia type setting is probably going to end up being like that. I don't read a ton of those, but maybe Skyward comes to mind, perhaps even Divergent.
I don't know about Divergent, but maybe Caravel?
I haven't read Caravel, but I think Divergent at least sort of counts. I know it's more of a teacher-student thing, but there's animosity. Like, they aren't fans of each other, and then they grow to be fans of each other.
I don't know. I'd have to go back and read it again.
A quick Google search does indicate that the internet says it is enemies to lovers.
Yeah, well, it's hard to argue with the internet.
So there are entire lists of just that subtype of academia rivals, and we can put a link in the description of this video of some of those lists because I don't have a lot of examples off the top of my head.
I think the biggest one right now is probably Fourth Wing, which you haven't read.
I'm working on it. It's on my TBR.
Yeah, but that's actually one I have very mixed feelings about that book, but I do think that the enemies to lovers there was done in a way that was pretty good. And of course, you might have guessed, I love Pride and Prejudice, so I have to toss that one in there. Like, they're enemies to lovers for sure, but dang it, they're civilized about it.
Those are the words of a gentleman.
Forgive me, madam, for taking up so much of your time.
Yeah, it's more of that rival to lovers feel that I usually enjoy more.
And you know, I can even really enjoy a true enemies to lovers when it's done well. I love the romance in the Ember and the Ashes series, and they were full-on enemies.
Yeah, but they weren't personally enemies.
That's true, and that I think is an important distinction. That's why it works for me, is because they're not personally enemies.
Ember is a bit like Romeo and Juliet, and I like those because it's more about the cultural enemies and realizing that there are good people everywhere.
And the other thing that makes it work is that A, Elias is never awful to Leia, and B, they're both trying to just be good people. Again, it kind of goes back to that they both have a plot arc. They're both people trying to do things with separate goals and motivations and conflicts, and then they come together in a way that works super well.
Yeah, they're both really well developed, and they make sense together. Not like some of those toxic, fall in love with your abuser stories that we've probably all read.
Yeah, that's where I draw a hard line. If there's ever abuse or manipulation or anything like that, I'm out. And again, no judgment if you like that kind of thing. Like, read what you enjoy. It makes my skin crawl enough. I don't like the whole Stockholm Syndrome abuse vibe, and so I just kind of tend to steer clear of it.
Agreed. But for me, my big no on enemies to lovers comes from severity and speed.
Ooh, what do you mean by that?
Prepare yourself for a rant. I can be fine with them being enemies, even violent enemies, if they're fighting each other in a battle to defend their separate kingdoms. Big conflict type thing. Like, sure, you can try to murder each other and end up in love, and I'm cool with it. Especially if there is a lot of time in between there for them to understand the other person as an individual, for circumstances to change, for there to be a greater common enemy, get to know each other as people, all of that kind of stuff. There has to be time, because they need to be able to heal. But if it's like, you killed my father and all of my people, and then you took me captive and abused me and treated me as a slave, and then 3 weeks later, we're in love because I realized that your dark broodingness was just too attractive, I'm out. Like, I'm not having it.
It's exactly how our relationship went. He kidnapped me, and then his dark broodingness just was too much.
So freaking dark and brooding.
Yeah. Ladies, you feel me?
So Fallen Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes is one of those that just didn't do it for me in this area. Again, no offense, Morgan. No offense if you love the book. It's just that the crimes that some of the characters committed against each other were too severe, too intense for how quickly their opinions of each other turned around.
Yeah, I want there to be enough time for the people to realistically fall in love with each other. And that's actually a problem that I have with a lot of romances in general. I feel like they happen way too fast. I mean, in real life, that's a decision that we really take our time with and are careful with. Too many books just happen way too fast for me.
Sometimes that's just how the book has to go. Like if it's a standalone single book, sometimes things just have to move fast. If it's a series, let it develop. That's one of the benefits for me of series versus a standalone book, is standalone books sometimes have to just be like, these people were around, and because they were around, love.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Slow burn is the best. I love me a good slow burn romance. Oh, so good.
So we've already hit on some of the related tropes, just naturally as we've talked, like the subtrope of rivals to lovers, and maybe we mentioned the opposite of love at first sight.
Which somehow both Romeo and Juliet managed to do. Enemies/rivals to lovers and love at first sight.
Romeo and Juliet are a lot of tropes. They're star-crossed lovers, they're forbidden love, they're all kinds of things.
They're the tropes.
They are every romance trope.
Thanks, Shakespeare. Appreciate you.
But what are some other related tropes?
Well, forbidden love is really similar. And actually, for being realistic, I think that's more the Romeo and Juliet one. There's also the cultural divide, where they come from really different cultures, and that kind of drives a wedge in their relationship. Sort of like The King and I.
Alright, so I am vaguely familiar with The King and I, but mostly from We Didn't Start the Fire.
Randall, the King and I, and the Catcher in the Rye.
It's a play?
Yeah, yes. It is an old novel turned Broadway play, turned movie, turned another movie. And when I say old, I'm thinking like 1950s. And I think that might have been the play. The book might have been even earlier. But that's the one that I first thought of when it's cultural divide. Anyway, often in enemies to lovers, the reason they're enemies is because their cultures are at war. So there's the cultural divide problem. And then finally, there's forced proximity, which we talked about in our last video, You, Me, and the Nightmare Painter, where the people are forced into proximity to each other. And then because of that, they learn to love each other and to work together. And it leads to either a friendship or a romance, depending on what type of book you've picked up.
And usually in forced proximity, they start out not really liking each other for some reason. There's tension or conflict, animosity. Again, not necessarily enemies specifically, but at least annoyance at having to be spending time with them.
Yeah, I think it might have been the podcast Writing Excuses that I was listening to, where they pointed out that like buddy cop movies and romance movies often have the same overarching arcs. You know what I mean? Like, they don't necessarily love each other, they're kind of a little leery of each other, but then by the end they're best friends and they can work together, or they're in love and they can be together.
Buddy cop movies are actually just forced proximity romance tropes.
Yeah!
So once again, check the description for some lists of books you might like if you like some of these different tropes and subtropes, and let us know in the comments what your favorite tropes are.
We plan on this one being an ongoing series, so we'll pick our next one from your suggestions.
Go read some books!
Yeah!